Devil May Cry 3, supposedly the one, the series-defining masterpiece that totally made up for the travesty of DMC2 and set a new high bar for action games that today arguably has only been surpassed by its own sequel. Or at least that's what all the comments on my last few videos have been telling me.
No doubt, you've got some fun planned for me.
For the sake of clarity, because there have been a lot of comments made about this or that version of the first two games having problems that weren't there in the original games, this is the PS4 HD collection that I'm playing. I know about the improvements to DMC3 made in the new Switch version, we'll talk about that a bit later on, but this is the version that I have. And not that I think it matters all that much, but I played about the first 8 missions or so without recording it just to get a feel for the combat, and then I went back and started recording every mission with everything I got from the first 8, which is why I'm fighting Cerberus using Agni and Rudra. I figured as I was getting a handle on the basics of combat, I would just be dying over and over, and nobody really wants to see that, and I don't want to have to sit through footage of me having no idea how to fight or where to go. That shit's just no fun for anybody. So I did my first blind playthrough on normal, and at time of writing, I'm about halfway through a playthrough on hard difficulty. Not recording that one, just doing it for fun. So, it's time for me to see for myself what the big deal is with Devil May Cry 3. So as the only prequel in the series, this is the real beginning of Dante's story, and the game wastes no time introducing Dante and setting the tone. Dante's brother Virgil has summoned the evil demonic tower of Temen-ni-Gru. I'm just gonna call it the Tower, if that's alright with everyone. And Dante sets out to stop Virgil's evil plan to summon the tower, and actually, I'm not entirely sure what he was going to do with the tower. Virgil's plan to merge the demon and human worlds falls by the wayside pretty quickly in favor of a secret plot by his sidekick Arkham, who is also Jester, who is also Lady's dad, who is also Sparta once he gets the sword. And I'll be honest, I got a little lost in the details of what was going on, but the characters were solid enough and the spectacle fun enough that I wanted to get to the end just to see what other crazy stuff was going to happen. Is it a masterwork of subtle and complex storytelling? No, not really. It's more about the spectacular moments and the intensity of the characters' emotions, but that is called playing to your strengths. And that tends to be how it goes with stories and games for me. Games really aren't my go-to medium if I want an intricate, subtle, deep story because, well, they tend not to be that great at it mostly.
Come on, man. Cut me some slack.
But that's why my bar for enjoying a game's story is pretty low. If you've got memorable characters, a well-paced plot, a story that doesn't confuse or annoy me, then you've basically ticked all my boxes. This is the first time in the series where the seemingly disparate tones of DMC really came together for me and started working with each other instead of, as I felt in DMC1, against each other. It's hard to pinpoint every difference that made it work for me here and not in the first game, but I think the most important thing is a greater focus on Dante himself and more confident, consistent writing for all the characters. He works great as the hero who's just too strong to really give a shit, and that comes across really well because of how consistent it is through most of the game, coupled with the few key moments where it isn't the case. The times where Dante is outmatched and really cares about the fight at hand stand out all the more because of the contrast, and I think this is where DMC3 really outshines DMC1. DMC1 just had so much less dialogue that the radical shifts in tone were kinda jarring to me. In DMC3, the stakes are usually a bit clearer and the character writing more consistent, so most of the time when Dante's being silly, I can sit back and enjoy the show. When Dante switches to serious mode, I know that shit's getting real. Dante, to me, is the main reason why the story works as well as it does. But I think Virgil deserves some credit as well. His cold demeanor and great banter with Dante make for some really fun contrasts between the two brothers. I also have to mention that Dante stars in one of my absolute favorite parts of the game. About halfway through, there's a boss fight with Beowulf, and you don't get a devil arm from him, which disappointed me at first, and then a few missions later, Virgil finishes off Beowulf, takes his devil arm, and then uses it against you in the next fight. And then when you defeat him and take Beowulf for yourself, you can use all the same moves Virgil used against you in that fight. It's just such a cool moment, and it shows how ruthless and powerful Virgil is, emphasizes the brothers' connection by showing how they fight and power up in the same way, and it makes for a great boss fight with a foe that you've fought before who now has a whole new set of moves to figure out. It's a great setup, and every fight with Virgil has a similar level of care and thought put into it, raising the stakes at just the right moments during the course of the plot. Exploration is a lot more fun in this game than it was in DMC1. It retains the same basic idea of an immense interconnected world that you explore piece by piece in each mission, but it usually delivers on that idea a lot better. In DMC1, there was a bit of backtracking within the castle, but you also spent a lot of time in random areas around the castle that a lot of the time didn't really feel like they had anything to do with the castle itself. What I really like about the tower in DMC3 is that I found I got a sense of the internal structure, the logic behind the tower. It's still an otherworldly labyrinth, but I felt like I had a better understanding of where I was going throughout the game. I did get lost a handful of times, but honestly, they were mostly because I forgot to pay attention to a text blurb here or there. The camera is under your direct control a lot more often during combat, which I definitely prefer, and control is only taken away to show off the beautifully rendered environments, or for combat encounters where the entire arena can be shown with just one angle. It's still fixed during exploration segments, but thankfully, the sudden jarring camera changes don't really happen during combat. Combat and exploration are still kept very separate in this game, which I usually think makes both less interesting, but in DMC3 the combat already has so much going on that the few encounters that take place in large, more complex arenas are actually usually less fun than the fights that happen in the smaller box rooms. As visually intricate and realistic as the castle was in DMC1, those rooms weren't all conducive to good combat encounters, and of course DMC2 went way overboard with how big and open the levels were. Overall, the aspects where 1 and 2 struggled the most, story, character, and exploration, have been improved a ton in 3. This is basically already the best game in the series so far, just on those merits alone, and there's of course one final thing left to talk about. So, before we get to the part where I both praise and criticize the combat, I think it's important to make a distinction between problems that I think are inherent to the game itself, and ones that are just a result of my lack of skill or experience. I don't think it's wrong to point out where a game mechanic that's too hard or too technically demanding made one's experience with the game worse. I just think it's important to recognize and acknowledge when that's the problem. And there are a lot of things in this game that I'm just not good enough yet to do. Using Royal Guard effectively, jump canceling, and I'm sure all kinds of way more advanced tech that I have no idea about. But I'm gonna try to point out what I think are objective flaws without letting my own low skill at the game overshadow everything. So with that out of the way, we can finally get to the combat, and this is where things get really interesting. Yeah, the story's fine and the exploration is nice, but of course the combat is the real meat of Devil May Cry, and that feels especially true in its third iteration. In terms of depth, if DMC1 was a normal swimming pool, DMC2 is a puddle, DMC3 is the Pacific Ocean. There is just so much Dante can do in this game, to the point that even from the start I was starting to feel a little overwhelmed. From the get-go, you've got 4 styles to choose from: Trickster, Gunslinger, Royal Guard, and Swordmaster. The circle button went through a lot of changes in this trilogy, from doing the same thing as the square button in DMC1, to a really crappy dodge button in DMC2, finally settling into its new role as the style action in DMC3. And I'm pretty sure it stays that way for the rest of the main series. Style actions bring a whole new level of variety to Dante's moveset. Trickster for basic evasion, Gunslinger to give your guns new options, Swordmaster for more melee combos, and Royal Guard for defense. Swordmaster and Gunslinger are particularly impressive since they each grant you several entirely new moves for every single melee weapon and gun respectively. You do get 2 other styles as you progress, Quicksilver and Doppelganger, but on a first playthrough you're not really going to get much use out of them, and they seem more like fun niche options to play around with on later playthroughs. Dante gets a total of 5 guns and 5 melee weapons over the course of the game, and you can have 2 of each equipped at a time. 2 weapons equipped in each slot is just right, I think. Any more and it might get a little unwieldy switching between so many with just 1 button. That said, it would have been really nice to just be able to change my loadout at any point during each mission. This goes for guns, devil arms, and styles. Style switching during combat was clearly just something they hadn't thought of yet at this point, and that's fine, but I really don't see any good reason to not let the player just pause and change their loadout at any time.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
I'd love to see what could be done with this game with style switching implemented, which is exactly what the new Switch version does, but this is the version that I have, and I'm not going to shell out $20 for 1 new feature on a game that I already own. The lack of style switching also isn't a huge deal, and this is certainly better than in DMC1 where you had to click in the stick and there was a long animation between switching weapons, and it's a million times better than DMC2, but a hole in the ground is better than DMC2, so the less said about that game the better as far as I care. So those are the major changes, but there have been a lot of subtle changes to the gameplay that are small but have a huge effect on how the game feels. The soft lock that annoyed me so much in 1 and 2 is finally gone, and now if you aren't locked on, Dante will thankfully just swing his weapon in whatever direction you point the stick. It took us 3 games, but we finally did it, gang. Nice work. The gauge on the style rank meter is such a small change, but the impact it has on moment-to-moment gameplay is massive. Where before the style meter felt more or less like a vague suggestion of how much damage you've done in the last few seconds, now you've got a clear indication of exactly how stylish the game thinks you're being in this exact moment. In DMC1, it didn't really feel like it was measuring style, since you could pretty quickly get to S rank with a single attack that happened to hit a bunch of enemies. But in DMC3, I was always checking the gauge to see when it was time to switch weapons or break out a move I hadn't used in a while, and few things are more satisfying than getting a high rank in the middle of a hard fight. So as you've probably noticed, so far I haven't really had anything negative to say here, and that's because all I've discussed so far is basically Dante himself and what he can do. Because that's the best part of the game. It really feels like Dante himself is the star of the show, in that he's the only thing that really feels complete in this game. He's a joy to control in combat, but so many enemies and bosses just aren't fun to fight, and they don't feel like they were specifically designed for Dante to fight. There's nothing wrong in theory with enemy types that require certain strategies to beat, sure. It wouldn't be any fun if you could just beat the entire game easily, only using the same strategy over and over. But there are way too many enemies that are just straight up not fun to fight. Bloodgoyles, Soul Eaters, and the Fallen are all extremely annoying to fight, only really being weak to one weapon or strategy generally, and Chessmen and Doulahans are just kinda boring. The various 7 Hells are really the only enemy type that are consistently fun and not frustrating to fight. I found their attack cues to be the clearest to spot, and they're usually good combo fodder since any of your weapons work fine on them. But enemies that hide in walls, enemies that only become vulnerable when you turn away from them, these just aren't very fun, and they tend to make combat drag on if you didn't happen to bring the right weapons to deal with them. A lot of the bosses have kind of a similar issue. Virgil is great, of course, all 3 of his fights. Agni and Rudra are really fun, especially once I figured out how to make them hit each other. Beowulf and Cerberus were fun too. The other bosses, though, are a little too basic or annoying to fight if you don't already know what loadout to bring. The best bosses are the ones that feel like beefed up normal enemies. You know, encounters that feel like tests of the skills we've been developing up to this point. They're about finding and exploiting enemy weaknesses and openings in the same way that we've been doing with normal combat encounters the whole game. But platforming onto a worm's back and wailing on it with almost no danger, hitting some big meat sacks while ads constantly spawn. The worst bosses are the ones that feel like you have to play a little mini game with them before they become vulnerable, and once they are vulnerable, you basically just smack them over and over with whatever you want, rinse and repeat until they die. And not every boss is like that, of course, but there's definitely a few too many of them. Nevin is maybe the one iteration of this type of boss that's still actually fun to fight, since she's got a good variety of moves that are fun to dodge. Plus, all of her moves have sound cues that are pretty easy to quickly pick up on. And that's the other problem with these types of bosses. Sure, they have cues and tells, but figuring them out on your first time fighting them is not very fun. And until you do, the fights kinda just feel unfair. Arkham is the main example of this, and God, we're gonna have a whole section about that part of the game soon, so just you wait.
It's like staring into a backed up toilet.
Now, these complaints about boss design may sound hypocritical coming from somebody who in the past has praised the reboot. And honestly, no joke, this is exactly what I was hoping would happen. Experiencing these games has given me new context for understanding why people weren't happy with the reboot. I didn't go into this series hoping that I would come out of it hating the reboot. I still enjoy it on its own merits. But this boss thing is an example of older games helping me to get a new perspective on what good boss fights can look like, and also why certain types of boss fights aren't all that satisfying. The boss fights in the reboot are exclusively the minigame type. Dodge all of their stuff until they do some incredibly obvious thing, and then they don't move while you mash buttons on them. There's no real room for skill expression in fights like this, and unfortunately, all the way back in DMC3, the supposed gold standard for the series, they were doing a lot of these kinds of fights. these mostly aren't bad fights, they're just kind of uninspired and dull. Doppelganger in particular has a gimmick that's so easy to figure out it's almost insulting, and once you do, he's basically just a huge pushover. Leviathan only has like 2 attacks that really take no effort to avoid, but the fight just feels like a challenge because it takes so long. I'm sure some of these less interesting bosses may have secret advanced techniques for fighting them, where you can beat the boss in like 1 cycle like a speedrunner, but I'm willing to bet none of those are able to be performed on a first playthrough, and they're probably really hard to pull off and not worth the effort for someone like me doing a casual playthrough. The game starts out incredibly strong, but it really starts to drag towards the end. The last 5 or 6 missions is where they start rolling out the most annoying enemies and bosses, along with some pretty questionable level design. Mission 15 is just a backtrack fest through a bunch of confusingly laid out doors. Mission 17 features the worst platforming section of the entire series yet. Here I was hoping they learned their lesson and ditched platforming altogether, but it's back. So many design choices in this game are just kind of baffling. Like, did they really think these missions were fun? They finally made a game with a really great combat system, now they just need a game that actually suits that combat system. Dante controls perfectly, and the variety and balance of his moveset is generally awesome. I just wish the game knew that and didn't waste my time with boring enemy design and garbage levels towards the end of the game. And speaking of garbage levels towards the end of the game, let's talk about Mission 19. This is the penultimate mission of the game and sees you facing off against Arkham after he's absorbed the power of Sparta. And this is the absolute low point of the game. This boss fight rides that perfect line that all bad boss fights do, where it's frustratingly unfair while being so simple that it's boring. Arkham only has a few attacks, big blobby arm sweeps, summoning projectiles that more often than not come from behind and through his body so they're impossible to see coming, and a bunch of annoying ads that swarm you and give you no option to combo them or show your skill or do anything except pick a button, mash it, and pray you don't get overwhelmed. I resorted to using Swordmaster and just spamming air raid to stay away from his attacks and hoping I'd have enough health left to tank a few hits from these stupid fish that he spawns. And so many times I got so damn close, and this is when I decided, screw it. I'm getting so close, I just need to buy a couple more blue orbs to survive this fight, and then I'm done. So that's what I did. I went back to Mission 1, I blasted through it in a minute or 2 with an A or S rank, got a bunch of red orbs for my trouble, and bought those last few things I needed to finish off Arkham. This fight absolutely sucks, and it should have been an amazing triumphant moment when Virgil joins you and the brothers work together one last time to defeat a greater evil before their final confrontation. This should have been great, but instead it's the worst part of the game, and the only part that frustrated me so much that I would rather grind out a few health upgrades rather than try to beat this fight the right way. Now, I think there is something interesting going on here. Why was this the one part of the game where I was okay with essentially cheesing a boss fight by grinding? There were certainly parts before this where I had trouble. The first fight with Virgil absolutely kicked my ass the first time I tried it, and I knew that the possibility of grinding red orbs was there this whole time, so why didn't I grind red orbs at any other point? Simply put, every other hard part of DMC3 felt more or less like a real balanced challenge. A fair amount of it was kind of annoying, but it never felt unfair to the point where I felt like I had no other option but to just buff myself up with better numbers. It always felt like there was something I had to improve about how I was playing in order to beat whatever hard boss. Arkham is the one and only time where the game truly felt unfair and unfun. Like, no matter what I did, I just didn't have enough health to survive this fight. And maybe that's my own problem of playing badly. I'm sure there's gonna be plenty of comments saying, oh, Arkham is easy, you just need to do this and that, and if you think he's hard on normal, try Dante Must Die mode, scrub, blah-de-blah. But I just don't really care, to be completely honest. This was the only part of the game that I felt asked too much of me. And that's what DMC3 does so incredibly well most of the time. It asks a lot of the player on a first playthrough to learn quickly and experiment with new strategies and execute on them well. But it's forgiving enough that the game is still fun even if you can't meet that incredibly high level of execution. There's this potential in the combat system for insane depth, but on a base level, the game is just fun to play. And while I think it's cool that the potential is there, I don't think there's anything wrong with just playing the game on normal and having fun with it. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about this game, but a lot of people have this expectation that in order to criticize a game, you need to have mastered it, and I don't really think that's reasonable. And in most cases, I have to say the DMC fans commenting on my videos have been very welcoming, just seemingly happy that someone else is trying to get into and appreciate a series they like.
We have to be gracious hosts.
And that's really nice to see. But of course, there's always going to be that small subset that say I'm not playing it right or I'm not allowed to have an opinion because of this or that way I did or didn't play the game. And you know what's funny? Those comments actually ended up having kind of a negative effect on my first initial experience with DMC3. At first, I resisted my temptation to use Trickster most of the time, since I just kind of assumed that people would call me a pleb given how much shit I got for suggesting a dedicated dodge button a few videos ago. In hindsight, those comments are kind of funny to me because, I mean, like, what is Trickster if not a dedicated dodge button? I mean, I'm kidding, mostly. I mean, I know it's not exactly the same thing since Trickster has a lot of varied uses besides the quick dodge function. I just think it's kind of funny. But what I realized partway through the game is that I had been avoiding using Trickster, even though it seemed like the most practical and fun style to use most of the time, because I was afraid of what hardcore fans would say if they saw me using it all the time. And I found that I really started enjoying this game when I decided to abandon what I thought was considered the right way to play the game and just played it in the way that I found to be most fun. I had been subconsciously imposing all of these house rule style challenges on myself, like don't use the Trickster easy dodge button too much because it's for noobs, don't ever use items even on a frustrating boss because you're not going to get a good rank and people are going to make fun of you. Throw all that shit out the window and just use whatever's fun for you. I used Rebellion, Ebony and Ivory, and Trickster for a large majority of the game, and I regret nothing. Maybe if I decide to get into higher difficulties, I might look up what builds and strategies other people recommend for certain levels, and some more advanced tech, but I really think the most fun way to play this game is blind, default difficulty, no worrying about what is or isn't the right way to play. This is already, I think, my longest video at this point, and I haven't even touched on the fact that you can play the entire game as Virgil, there's a Bloody Palace mode, the puzzle design generally is pretty good, the fantastic music, all kinds of other stuff, but I have to draw the line somewhere. I don't have time to talk about every single thing this game has to offer, and in the end I realized that by only playing normal mode, I'm barely scratching the surface of this game, and I think to some extent that kind of applies to the previous games in the series, but where DMC3 is different is that this is the first time where I've wanted to dig into it more, to see some of that amazing mechanical depth for myself, and I do plan on doing that. But for now, I can safely say that this is the best game in the series so far, the first one that I've actually enjoyed more than the reboot, and this may have changed how I look at all-action games like this forever. It's not a perfect game, but I had a hell of a time playing it, and I am going to play more. Anyway, that is gonna do it for this video. Like, comment, and subscribe because DMC4 is up next, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.